Ancient Earth History, Part 4 America, by guest author June 19, 2022. Guest article by Robert Dawson.
All those, however, who have no knowledge or memory of what the history of America is really based on, are condemned to believe what they are lied to, and so they live with the lie, and also die with it.
Billy Meyer from Contact Report 797.
The topic of the most recent contact reports between Billy Meyer and the Plejarans has mostly been dominated by the current events on the world stage involving the war in Ukraine. Nonetheless, Billy takes times to remind us of our need to know and understand our history, particularly in America, as a construct of myths, bias, ignorance, and outright lies that has mindfully been steered and crafted with intent and an end goal in mind which is directly relevant to today.
What excerpt from Contact Report 797.
However, the fact that it is the treacherous, selfish, and autocratic Ukrainian presidency that is the root cause of all this is denied so vehemently by the USA that the truth has long been forgotten, and it is called a fib. This is happening to today's events just as it has happened to the whole of American history, and to the Indian Wars since time immemorial. For the traditions are so riddled with lies and fraudulent statements that the beams are cracking in the rafters. I know all this from my time with Sva Oth, as well as from Native Americans I have spoken to myself. It is important and appropriate to say something about this, because what is to be said is completely different from what the traditions of America generally say, and make those human beings believe who are believers, and therefore believe the lies. The first human beings to reach the continent of America by sea were very early sea conquerors. They sailed over from Africa and China on rafts about 17,500 years ago, while the first human beings reached America over a land bridge from Europe 14,500 years ago. These immigrants, together with the indigenous peoples, formed whole nations that developed into advanced civilizations in much later times, such as the Inca and the Maya, etc., whose early ancestors settled in the south of the continent, whose distant descendants were then robbed and partly also murdered by the Spaniards because of the gold, which was often mixed with copper, and therefore not pure. When Christopher Columbus sailed to the continent of America in 1492, he was already the umpteenth new discoverer of America, because thousands of years before him, other human beings had already come to this continent over land and water, and mixed very early with the indigenous people who lived as distant descendants of the early human beings developing on this continent, when the land was still connected with what is now called Asia and Europe. And indeed, it was not the first time that human beings from Europe found the sea route to America, for earlier and long before him, the Northmen were in America and settled there, such as the Viking Eric the Red, and later also his son, but they disappeared again.
And again later in Contact Report 799, Billy makes a point to say it again.
This is also the case with the continent of America, which was still connected to Europe and Asia 18,000 years ago, and where Europeans and Chinese went to America at that time, that is to say a long time before Columbus, who was a distant straggler from Europe and many millennia later, when the Africans from today's Africa were still dry-footed, and also centuries before him rafted, with large fins from the Mali region in Africa to South America.
Researchers and artists have reconstructed the face of a teenage girl who lived 12,000 years ago in Mexico, and it's not the kind of face a person might typically associate with Native Americans. The remains of the girl, nicknamed Naya after the Greek term for a water nymph, were recovered from an underwater cave on Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula. Naya is regarded as one of the earliest known residents of the Americas. The oldest complete skeleton of its kind ever found is helping solve a mystery about the differences in body types between the first humans to arrive in the Americas and later Native Americans. The team led by archaeologist James Chatters reported in the journal Science that they'd found a big piece of the puzzle, the most complete skeleton of such antiquity ever found in the Americas, between 12,000 and 13,000 years old. Chatters described Naya's face as about the opposite of what Native Americans look like today. To see those features coupled with genetic markers indicating a common lineage with Native Americans is highly significant. Genetic analyses of modern Native Americans indicate they descend from a founding population that originated in Asia. This new discovery complements another recent finding in Montana of 12,600-year-old remains of an infant whose genomic sequencing revealed a shared ancestry. Now we've got two specimens, both from a common ancestor that came from Asia, he said.
Source: National Geographic article. Most complete Ice Age skeleton helps solve mystery of first Americans. Ancient bones provide glimpse of the New World's earliest inhabitants. By Glenn Hodges, May 15, 2014.
The illustration above first appeared in a Midwest U.S. newspaper in the early part of the 1900s, when archaeologists were uncovering a great amount of ancient antiquities in Central America. Some researchers had spotted the similarities at that time between the cultures of ancient China and the cultural artifacts of ancient civilizations found in Mexico, but it did not have the academic support it needed to challenge the already established belief paradigms. So just how did the false historical narrative of America that made up its belief paradigms that Billy refers to in the contact notes come into being? Christopher Columbus and the myth of discovery. Let us begin at the most famous of beginnings. Stephen Greenblatt, Marvelous Possessions. The mythology of the New World begins with the discourse of discovery mistakenly attributed to Christopher Columbus, and with powerful European projections that envision a new kind of paradise, a utopia somewhere across the Atlantic that alleviates the grievances of the old world, and that promises boundless earthly riches. Although this primal scene in 1492 precedes the formation of the USA as a nation-state by several hundred years, it has developed into one of its core foundational myths, and, for all its historical remoteness, has profoundly shaped the national imaginary. The story of Christopher Columbus, 1451 to 1506, and his arrival in the Americas holds a pivotal place in an American foundational mythology that stages the discovery and the subsequent settlement and colonization of the New World in prophetic ways as an inevitable step forward in the course of human progress that eventually would lead to the founding of the USA and to U.S.-American westward expansion, its manifest destiny. Source: The Myths That Made America. By Heike Paul. One may wonder why, when, and how an Italian explorer became an American hero. Why Columbus, who never set foot on the land that would later become the United States, and who never knew in his lifetime that in 1492 he had not landed in Asia, has been considered one of the founding figures of the U.S.-American nation. Columbus, with an image oscillating between the arch-villain of the modern era for bringing genocide and pollution to an unsullied earthly paradise, and someone worthy of sainthood. Even though Columbus quickly rose to fame in his time and day, he fell out of grace with the monarchs toward the end of his life and was even shortly imprisoned on charges of mismanaging the colony. Jack Shreve, Christopher Columbus. So just how did Columbus get elevated to the mantle of the discoverer of America? The story is understandable in the context of the crafting of the image of the USA. But if an historical past and an historical memory are indeed essential ingredients for a viable nationalism, what was the new United States to do in 1776 or in 1789, or for that matter at almost any time before the Civil War? How does a country without a past of her own acquire one? Or how does she provide a substitute for it? Where could such a nation find the stuff for patriotism, for sentiment, for pride, for memory, for collective character? Henry Steele Commager. The Search for a Usable Past. Christopher Columbus, it seems, was the historical figure most useful in the search for a usable past, which had 18th-century Americans colonial subjects of the British Crown seeking independence look for meaningful beginnings. It is in the last decades of the 18th century that the specifically North American myth of Columbus comes into existence, and in a very brief time span is firmly consolidated and embroidered. In the process of transmission from Spanish language to English language sources, William Robertson's 1778 History of America is highly influential. This book was available to more American colonists than was any earlier source, and devoted hundreds of pages to Columbus, who, according to Robertson, in his endeavors combined the superiority of genius with ardent enthusiasm. Others followed Robertson in elevating Columbus and in crediting him with the discovery of a new world. Source: America Discovers Columbus, How an Italian Explorer Became an American Hero, by Claudia Bushman. American painter John Vanderlyn, 1775–1852, was commissioned by U.S. Congress in June 1836 to paint the landing of Columbus for the Capitol Rotunda. In this romanticized image, Columbus looks upward as if in reverent gratitude with his hat tossed to the ground in a sign of humility. The indigenous people cower in fear of the superior might of the Europeans and are merely part of the landscape with the same importance as the macaw bird perched in the tree. And before Abraham Lincoln, Christopher Columbus was on the U.S. $5 bill. The mythology of Columbus was told with pictures for all to know, even if you could not read. On the front of the bill to the left, Christopher Columbus in sight of land for the first time. At the right, a presentation of an Indian princess representing America to the Old Word. On the reverse is Vanderlyn's painting, The Landing of Columbus, which was also used on many types of U.S. postage stamps. And many public figures and writers gathered around Columbus as a historical persona to affirm North American independence, and they represented him as a figure of national consensus, exemplifying American national virtues and an American national character. In political culture, in public discussions of memorial practices and naming, in poetry, non-fiction, and the visual arts, Columbus figures as a patron and ancestor of those Americans who were demanding their independence from England and who later became citizens of the new republic. Source: The Invention of America, An Inquiry into the Historical Nature of the New World and the Meaning of its History, by Edmundo O'Gorman. An early artistic rendition of Columbia as born in the minds of several writers and poets during the American Revolution to generate patriotism and resolve for their perceived noble efforts. Christian leaders/settlers from the 1700, the 1800s referred to their violent displacements of native people as ordained by God, and themselves as God's chosen people fulfilling a preordained destiny. During the Civil War, both the United States and the Confederacy used Columbia's image and cried her name in battle. "Hail Columbia" was the national anthem before the Star-Spangled Banner. Another song, Columbia, the Gem of the Ocean, reached a height of popularity during the presidency of Abraham Lincoln, as well as Columbia, the Land of the Brave. In this highly partisan cartoon from the Civil War, Columbia confronts an evasive President Lincoln and accuses him of squandering the lives of her sons. Lady Columbia goes to war. The goddess Columbia, who stood by the side of Washington during the Revolutionary War against the British, now tells Americans they must enlist in the army to fight in the European conflict we call World War I. We must do what she says. Vincent Adarente, artist, and Francis Adams Halstead, designer. Columbia Calls, 1916. Library of Congress.
Naming the New World.
Amidst discussions of naming the new nation, Columbia had been informally adopted as an alternative to America on the eve of the American Revolution. The suffix "ia" was slapped onto the name Columbus's to make it sound more Latin. Even if made up, more Latin equals more official equals tradition. It became a lyrical term for America envisioned as a female allegorical figure in revolutionary poetry. In 1776, Phyllis Wheatley penned one of the earliest descriptions of Columbia as a personification of the American nation in her poem, His Excellency General Washington. The goddess comes, she moves divinely fair, olive and laurel binds her golden hair. Wheatley follows her male contemporaries in pairing Columbus and George Washington commander-in-chief of the revolutionary troops for patriotic purposes. This tandem of two foundational figures is forcefully evident in highly symbolic practices of naming in the early republic. The U.S. capital is named Washington, whereas the government district, ceded by Virginia and Maryland in 1791, is named District of Columbia. George Washington's farewell address is published in 1796 as Columbia's Legacy. The geographer and mathematician Martin Waldseemüller introduced the name America for the new continent he mapped in his Cosmographiae Introductio in 1507, after the wide circulation of Amerigo Vespucci's Mundus Novus letter about his third journey to South America in 1501 and 1502, which had been published immediately in various languages. And the name stuck. Thomas Jefferson, when drafting the Declaration of Independence in June 1776, needed a term to replace the United Colonies and chose United States of America, but he meant it to only be temporary. But a few months later, the Second Continental Congress formally adopted the new name, and most people accepted this misnaming as a fait accompli. Columbia became the counterpart to Britain's protective war goddess Britannia.
Excerpt from Contact Report 797.
Then, when the French and the English went at each other in Washington, the first president of America committed murder on a French peace negotiator carrying a white flag before he could even say a word. The murderous machinations against the indigenous people, the very Indians, officially broke out.
This is the war detail from the Apotheosis of Washington, painted in 1865 by Constantino Brumidi on the ceiling of the U.S. Capitol Rotunda, depicting George Washington rising to the heavens in glory, flanked by angelic figures representing liberty and victory fame. It has blatant similarities to Michelangelo's painting on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, with propaganda purposes. Like Michelangelo's God depiction, Washington extends his right hand with his index finger reaching out to Americans. And like Michelangelo's God, he is draped in a light burgundy-colored robe surrounded by angelic beings, but with the exception that this god holds a sword in his left hand. Goddess Columbia is shown below him, continuing the vigilance to fight all foreign aggressors. After the Revolutionary War and the newly formed United States of America won its independence from England, several different paintings were commissioned depicting British General Lord Cornwallis surrendering his sword to George Washington at Yorktown. They are all lies. Cornwallis was not even at the surrender. Nor for that matter was George Washington. Nor was it actually the end of the Revolutionary War. Cornwallis had a very low opinion of the rebelling colonists and sent his second-in-command, General Charles O'Hara, to surrender his sword instead. Washington, refusing to accept the sword of anyone but Cornwallis, appointed General Benjamin Lincoln to accept O'Hara's sword. And it was really not until the Treaty of Paris of 1783 that the American Revolutionary War formally ended. American statesmen Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay negotiated the peace treaty with representatives of King George III of Great Britain. In the Treaty of Paris, the British Crown formally recognized American independence.
An excerpt from Contact Report 797.
First of all, there is the longest war ever waged on Earth, which America waged against the indigenous people, the Indians, and which cost millions of human lives, when the American immigrants and their descendants stole the land through robbery and murder, and mercilessly slaughtered the real owners of the land, the indigenous people, or the Indians. It started back then, in the 15th century, when the first immigrants from Europe came to the country, often deported by the communities because they were not good people and therefore undesirables in the country. But there were also many refugees from their homeland, as sect fanatics, criminals, and then also poor people who saw the golden land of America as a new home or field of activity, and settled far into the West, which later became known as the Wild West, with cattle ranching states. America's war of terror against the Native Americans, or Indians, which lasted about 150 years, is by far the largest and longest conflict in U.S. history.
Colombia becomes a symbol for American imperialism.
The war against the indigenous people, the Indians, was justified as American progress, and personified in this famous painting American Progress by John Gast, 1872. The giant goddess Columbia leads the way in the westward expansion and exploitation of the American untamed West. It comes as no surprise that after the war, Manifest Destiny, another uniquely American myth, served as a shared mission that helped reunify the nation. Federal troops, state militias, and everyday people united against a common enemy, indigenous people, who must get out of the way of the overwhelming might brought by the new Americans. The object that Columbia holds in her right hand says, "School Book," which she now wields instead of her sword. James W. Loewen, best known for his 1995 book, Lies My Teacher Told Me, Everything Your American History Textbook Got Wrong, devoted an entire booklet to how the myth of Columbus's discovery is taught in American schools. He surveyed, among other things, 15 widely used high school and middle school textbooks of American history to see what they have to say about Christopher Columbus. His findings show that almost everything written about Columbus is either wrong or unknowable. The textbooks have taken us on a trip of their own, away from the facts of history into the realm of myth. The U.S. under President Theodore Roosevelt rebuilt its entire Navy fleet with steel-plated heavy armor and powerful long-range guns. Nicknamed the Great White Fleet, and its hulls painted white, Roosevelt sought to demonstrate growing American military power by sending the fleet on a round-the-world tour, stopping at every major port in which the U.S. had interests. It was by far the largest and most powerful fleet that had ever circled the globe. The song Columbia Rules the Waves glorified the superior American might and weaponry. From Wikipedia article on the Great White Fleet. Still, at the start of a lot of films, the most recognizable woman in Hollywood is also a visual reminder of American imperialism, and the image of Manifest Destiny endures through Columbia Pictures. She has assumed a stance resembling Lady Liberty such that they are almost indistinguishable.
Excerpt from Contact Report 797.
America, as it still is today, will be defined by its history and dissolved in the following times.
In an incredible twist of historical irony, the man who was convinced he had found a shortcut to China would never know that China had already beaten him to the New World by thousands of years.
A China excerpt from the article Pyramid of the Niches from Atlas Obscura.
In the humid jungles of the Mexican state of Veracruz lie the enigmatic ruins of El Tajin, an ancient city built by a mysterious lost civilization. The city of El Tajin is believed to have risen to power before the rise of the Aztec Empire. At its height, it was the most important center of the Mesoamerican Northeast, and its cultural influence was felt not only in the valleys and plateaus of central Mexico, but also throughout the Gulf Coast and the Mayan region. The most impressive and emblematic ruin of El Tajin is the Pyramid of the Niches. It rises 20 meters tall with 7-step terraces leading to the top. Each of its 4 sides is covered with stacked rows of small niches formed from blocks of stone. There are 365 total, suggesting this pyramid was used as a kind of astronomical calendar to track the days of the year. The identity of the lost civilization that built this marvel has puzzled generations of historians and archaeologists. It remains an enigma. Archaeologists estimate that the city once accommodated a population of between 15,000 and 20,000 people. They occupied numerous settlements that are now covered by jungle.
And this is a painting of the Pyramid of the Niches by the world-renowned Mexican muralist, Diego Rivera. What is shown in this picture is but a small portion of a much larger multi-wall mural which Diego painted in the National Palace in Mexico City, titled The History of Mexico. Several motifs from ancient Chinese architecture is evident, such as the roof style with the upturned eave corners and overall bilateral symmetry. Diego, who was noted for the historical accuracy in all of his paintings, based the building's Chinese features on descriptions of it found in multiple ancient Mexican documents. This is a photograph of the Pyramid of the Niches, as it is today, which is now part of the archaeological site of El Tajin. It is unclear who built the city. From Wikipedia article on El Tajin, a palace in Tokyo, Japan is shown here to provide a comparison in roof style to the Pyramid of the Niches. The green shaded area shown in this map defines the general area of what is referred to as the classic Veracruz culture in Mexico, which predates the Aztecs and Maya. Its boundaries approximate the Mexican state of Veracruz of today. El Tajin is located in the northern part of this zone. This jade mask recovered from this Veracruz archaeological zone displays facial characteristics of a Chinese man.
The end for El Tajin came around 1200 when a marauding Aztec army of eagle and jaguar knights invaded and pillaged the area. In the aftermath of the battle, the city was completely abandoned. Remarkably, the ruins of El Tajin remained unknown to the colonial authorities until 1785, when a Spanish official stumbled upon the site while looking for illegal tobacco plantations that breached the royal monopoly on the crop. The site then became famous and was visited by many European travelers and explorers over the years, who come to marvel at its sophistication. Today, despite being considered a masterpiece of Mesoamerican architecture, El Tajin is one of the least visited and most mysterious archaeological sites in Mexico.
A Pyramid of the Niches, Atlas Obscura.
Perhaps the most ubiquitous artifact in the Americas is the figurine. The figurines shown below were recovered from the classic Veracruz culture within the green area indicated on the map above, except where noted otherwise. Their representation of individuals having physical features of all three migration sources mentioned by Billy in the contact note excerpt, Chinese, African, and European, is a confirmation of its veracity. Ceramic death mask from the Remojadas culture located within the classic Veracruz area, Mexico 800, 1200 CE, photographed at the Portland Art Museum in Portland, Oregon. Seated figure wearing cape and helmet from Veracruz, Mexico. Published in the Face of Ancient America, p. 138. Photographs by Justin Kerr. Stone sculpture of ball player with helmet from Veracruz area. Photographed at the Portland Art Museum in Portland, Oregon. Then ceramic of a seated figure from Veracruz area, Mexico 800, 1200 CE, photographed at the Portland Art Museum in Portland, Oregon. He has Chinese facial characteristics and wears a helmet similar in style to the one worn by a Chinese soldier in this vintage photograph shown in the middle top. Several ceramic figurines from the Remojadas culture in Veracruz on display at the Mexico Museum of Anthropology. They have Chinese facial characteristics and wear a traditional Chinese hat called a hanfu, as shown in the drawing at middle bottom, taken from an ancient Chinese illustration. A terracotta seated figurine from the Veracruz classic area, wearing a cape and chest protector, published in the Face of Ancient America, p. 152. Photographs by Justin Kerr. Suspended above the head is a round, barrel-shaped parasol, similar to a type used in ancient China, as shown in the two illustrations in the middle. It is supported to the back with a brace so as to cantilever over the head. The face has distinctive features of both Chinese and African. Around the mouth area and the bridge above the nose, African scarification can be seen. An illustration from the Codex Mendoza of Atlacatecatl, the name for an Aztec commanding general, who would organize and plan out the campaign strategy as well as the distribution of provisions and the engineering of battles. He was also one of the 4 advisors to the emperor and would act as a dignitary. They are said to have worn a red cape, long yellow labret lip plug, a headband adorned with 2 quetzal feathers tassels, symbol of high rank. The parasol banner mounted on a back frame is said to have been used not only for certain traditional reasons, but also for protection from the sunlight, rain, and projectiles. Its design may be another example of cultural diffusion from China. A photograph of a similar terracotta figurine from the classic Veracruz zone. The African scarification can be seen in better detail. The facial features show the full lips of an African and yet a slanted eye pattern of a Chinese, an indication of intermixing. A photograph showing an example of the practice of African scarification. A woman or man would have scarification marks for many reasons that would distinguish him from anyone else, tell her his rank in society, family, clan, and tribe, and symbolize their beauty or strength. In some African tribes, it was like wearing your identity card on your face. In Africa, scarification is more visible on darker-skinned people than, say, tattoos. Source: The History of Scarification in Africa, Hadithi, Africa. An illustration of body armor worn by a samurai warrior. Scholars agree that Japanese armor first appeared in the 4th century with the discovery of the cuirass and basic helmets in graves. It is thought they originated from China via Korea. Wikipedia article on Japanese armor. Clay warrior from the classic Veracruz area, height 24. 5 centimeters. With heavy body armor. The Spaniards reported in early chronicles that these warriors made armor from heavy cloth that was soaked in brine to stiffen it with salt. He is probably missing a headdress mask. According to some scholars, the Chinese used a form of paper armor as early as 600 BC. Greg Martin, an expert on ancient armor, speculates that they may have been injected with shellac or some other resin, and that this armor was more effective in some ways than the steel armor used at the time. The period for the use of this armor predates the traditional date for the invention of paper. And this is a figurine of an Olmec warrior found in Guatemala wearing similar body armor. It is on display at the National Museum of Guatemala. His headdress is held in front, though his arms have long been broken off. He has African features with facial scarification. This ceramic statue of a man from the Veracruz area of Mexico shows him wearing ornate body armor and is on display at the Tamayo Museum in Oaxaca, Mexico. A comparison style of body armor from Japan. A more unusually garbed figurine from the Veracruz area of Mexico. A style of hat worn in ancient China to designate magistrates. a type of helmet kabuto used in ancient Japan to designate an officer. A Maya figurine on exhibit in Paris, France, wearing a kabuto-type helmet with Asian features. The earliest helmets used by the Japanese were modeled after Chinese and Korean helmets. Excerpt from the article Samurai Helmets at Kabuto.
The magnetized Chinese stone heads of Guatemala.
Ancient stone head and potbelly sculptures are magnetized on certain spots, suggesting the pre-Columbian civilization that made them had a practical knowledge of magnetism. 11 of these sculptures of giant heads and distorted bodies, known as potbellies, because of their distinctive rotund shapes, are on display in a plaza in the small town of La Democracia, near Guatemala's Pacific coast. They were installed there in the 1970s after being brought from ancient sites in the nearby Monte Alto region. The giant heads and bodies of the ancient sculptures were carved to make the magnetic anomalies align with either the sculpture's right cheeks or their belly buttons, suggesting that ancient sculptors knew how to detect magnetism, and that they had selected magnetic boulders to highlight these parts of the body. Source: Ancient Guatemalan Sculptors Knowingly Crafted Magnetic Potbelly Statues by Tom Metcalf, published in the Journal of Archaeological Science. Art historian Julia Guernsey, a professor at the University of Texas at Austin, who has written a book about Guatemalan potbelly sculptures, is enthusiastic about the new research. The finding gives strength to a theory that early Mesoamerican civilizations knew about the attractive properties of magnetism and how to detect it with magnetic objects like lodestones suspended on a string, possibly even before magnetism is first known to have been described in China about 2,700 years ago. The word people use in the literature is that there's a performative aspect to these sculptures. So when the sculptures deflected a magnetized stone, it would appear as though there was something alive with it, or some supernatural aspect to it. A tile mosaic of a two-headed serpent on display at the British Museum is attributed to the craftsmanship of the Mixtec, an American culture that predates the Aztecs and proliferated in the southwest portion of Mexico. The architectural remains of the Mixtec contain similarities to certain Chinese motifs. It is considered one of the most important pieces in the museum's entire collection because of the skill and craftsmanship involved in making and detailing this object is breathtaking. Feathered serpent or dragon, head detail of the Mayan Temple of the Masks. A photo of a large Chinese dragon puppet used in parades. A depiction of Ixchel, the goddess of the moon, was one of the most important deities of the Mayan culture due to the power that the star conferred on her over the lives of men. Examples of applied white makeup appear in several instances of ancient Americans, including the North American Indians in both archaeological artifacts and written histories, just as with Japan. Two examples of Japanese geisha wearing white makeup on their faces. Atop, a depiction from a mural painting of El Tajin by Diego Rivera, showing the use of white makeup used by a nobleman. Underneath is an actor in Japanese kabuki theater. In the valley of Oaxaca, located in the southern highlands of Mesoamerica, an indigenous pre-Columbian civilization, known as the Zapotec civilization or the Cloud People, flourished around 2,500 years ago. Among their archaeological remains are several examples of Hindu gods. This is a statue of the elephant-headed god Ganesha. a Far Eastern illustration of the elephant-headed Hindu god, Ganesha. And a figurine found in the jungle of Honduras sitting in a Hindu meditation pose. Statue of the Hindu god Garuda on display in Cochin, Kerala, India. The depiction of slanted eyes occurs in Mayan sculptures. Paintings, drawings, frescoes, stone relief, codex manuscripts, and even daily utilitarian items such as vases, and drinking vessels such as this one discovered in Guatemala, Pitan, Dos Pilas, or vicinity, 740–800 CE. It is on display at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. The subject is shown in a meditating position with his hand appearing to form a mudra.
Chan.
And Chan was the largest city of the pre-Columbian era in South America and was the capital of the historical empire of the Timur, developed from the Chimu culture, which established itself along the Peruvian coast. The name is probably derived from the Qingnam language, Zhang, or Chang, which means sun. Photogravure of Palace of the Chimu Princes by artist H.N. Cady in 1893. The Chimu eventually were conquered by the Inca around 1470 AD, and all of its riches would later be plundered by the Spaniards. Chan was the world's largest adobe city. This is an artist's conception based on archaeological findings. A temple wall from a Chimu archaeological site. The map depicting the extent of the Chimu culture on the Pacific shores of Peru with Chan at its center. One of the openings of the walled city. And the walls had a waffled interior that trapped dead air and provided incredible insulation from extreme temperatures. Close-up photo of one of the statue sentinels positioned at the outer walls. A picture of an old style of hat worn in China with pointy corners similar to the hat worn by the sentinel statue. For thousands of years, fishermen have used trained birds' cormorants to help them fish the rivers and lakes of China. The birds would snatch the fish with their long beak and return to the boat where the fishermen would then put it in a basket. The Chimu culture had a similar practice of fisherman and bird partnership, as depicted in the wall mural below, showing the boat, basket, fisherman, and bird, which is also enlarged at the middle bottom. And the walls were constructed with adobe bricks and covered with a smooth surface on which images were carved. These images had a maritime theme of fish, waves, and birds, and dragons. A wall on the Dragon Temple at the Chan compound. The top is a close-up of the double dragon motif on a wall of the Dragon Temple. Bottom is an example of the double dragon motif found in Chinese culture. And a statuette recovered at Chan is shown wearing a Chinese hat. A square Jin Fang Jin, a square soft hat issued in the early Ming dynasty, is made of black gauze, worn by officials. The seated figurine recovered in Oaxaca, Mexico from the Zapotec culture, 300 BC AD 700, wearing a similar hat and with Chinese eyes.
Maya.
When Christopher Columbus sailed to the continent of America in 1492, he was already the umpteenth new discoverer of America, because thousands of years before him, other human beings had already come to this continent over land and water and mixed very early with the indigenous people who lived as distant descendants of the early human beings developing on this continent, when the land was still connected with what is now called Asia and Europe.
These immigrants, together with the indigenous peoples, formed whole nations that developed into advanced civilizations in much later times, such as the Inca and the Maya, etc. Maya is a modern term used to refer collectively to the various peoples that inhabited this area. They did not call themselves Maya and did not have a sense of common identity or political unity. Today, their descendants, known collectively as the Maya, number well over 6 million individuals, speak more than 28 surviving Mayan languages, and reside in nearly the same area as their ancestors. Source: Invading Guatemala, Spanish, Nahua, and Maya. Accounts of the Conquest Wars by Matthew Restall and Florine Asselbergs, 2007. University Park, Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania State University. This is a sketch of a Mayan column known as Stela N, located at the Great Plaza at the Copan Ruins in Honduras, Central America. The Copan Ruins have been declared a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And this is a still shot from The Sword and the Brocade, an historical Chinese drama series set during the Ming Dynasty. The actress is wearing a traditional Chinese wedding headdress. When compared closely, a number of similarities can be noticed between the Chinese headdress and the headdress worn in the two Mayan columns. A face appears at the crown with 2 eyes and a nose, and large draping ear ornaments adorn the woman. And this is a sketch of another Mayan column known as Stela P, also located at the Great Plaza of Copan, Honduras.
The Mayan elephants.
At the left are the Mayan elephants, appearing on Stela B at Copan, a Mayan archaeological site as drawn by Sir Alfred P. Maudslay. Historians are generally dismissive that it actually represents an elephant, such as L. Sprague de Camp, who suggests that they represent macaw birds because elephants are not known to be indigenous to America. In the middle is a photograph of the elephant carving as it is today. To the right are more examples of elephants found in Mayan architecture. With the latest historical information provided by Billy in Contact Reports 797 and 799, it seems more probable that they depict real elephants coming from India or China and not macaw birds. Pictured here is a Hao Yu wine vessel from the Western Zhou dynasty. On its surface is a design pattern of straight-line inward spiral called step fret. The step fret pattern appears in several cultures of pre-Columbian Mesoamerica. And the Mayan ruins at Uxmal with elephants using their trunks to create hook designs. The hook design is also a Chinese characteristic as used on the sides of the wine vessel to the left. An example of the step fret used as an architectural corbel in this Chinese palace. Step fret is used in the architectural header at the Mayan governor's temple. A Mayan temple at the Tikal archaeological site in Guatemala. A very early molded clay tablet found at an early North India relic mound shows a stepped pyramid similar to the Mayan pyramid shown to the left. The writing is a Sharani script. From the Metropolitan Museum of Art Bulletin. Two examples of pyramid temples in Southeast Asia of similar style to the Mayan temple. The top is at Bakse Chamkrong in Cambodia, and the other is the Kokare Pyramid Temple also in Cambodia. What looks to be a field of Mayan temples teleported to a remote valley in the Himalayan mountains are actually whitewashed Buddhist stupas chortens. The coiled antennas mounted to the top of these stupas is similar to what is shown on top of the pyramid in the molded clay tablet above. The significance of this will be discussed in a future article about ancient alien technology. The Great Stupa in Mindroling Monastery in Dehradun, India is the largest stupa in the world. The large figure coming down the center steps is actually a large statue that is roughly 3 times the size of an average human. The small colored specks at the top landing on the right are real humans. And the contact notes of Billy Meyer contain information that the yellow races did not originate on Earth, but themselves were migrants from a different planet. The Kintan, who we call Chinese, and the Niper, who we call Japanese. This will be discussed in a future article as well as an article on the great civilizations of Atlantis and Mu, with Mu being located in the vicinity of the Gobi Desert in China. The next article will continue where this one left off with a focus on the early immigrants to America from Africa and Europe.
Article by Robert Dawson.